Hello and welcome to Your Life in 10, Series 1, Episode 2 with SDP leader William Clouston. When you were younger, what did you want to be when you were like a kid?
I don't think I had a clear idea. It was never a sort of, I want to be a spaceman or a fireman or whatever. I don't think I ever really did have a clear idea. I was influenced a lot by my father, who ran a successful landscape architecture business in the UK, and the sort of center of gravity was that. So built environment and developers and building things. And he had a business in Southeast Asia. One of the things I always wanted to do was to work in Hong Kong, because as a child I went there a lot, and Singapore to some extent. So I always imagined I would do that. But actually, true to myself, I should have really done philosophy first at university, and I got one of my 5 UCAS applications to do that, but the other 4 were town planning, which was something sensible. It was either that or surveying, because I didn't want to be an architect. And I did planning, and it served me pretty well. I left university and worked at Westminster for a while, which is a brilliant place to do development control. And then I did some retail policy and sort of went into property development from there, and surveying, what have you. But yeah, I expected I would have. I was very keen to work in Hong Kong, and I never did. And I got offered a job literally on graduating, and it was Westminster or Singapore, and I chose the sensible thing. So yeah, and I don't know. I don't actually know whether I don't know how healthy it is. I think, people say, let's imagine you've just done a law degree and doors are opening into that profession. Well, does that open life up? Does that open opportunity up, or does it really, in fact, narrow it down?
It gives you one door to go through.
Yeah, and so I don't know. I think it's always a balance between that, and it worked out for me. I mean, planning was a very good degree to do, because it was a sort of urban geography basically, and so it's got a bit of sociology, a bit of economics, a bit of transport planning, a bit of urban design, and so on. So I would say 4 years of that's pretty good. I never regretted doing it, but I don't know. I've sort of had a few careers, really, I suppose, if you add them all end to end. And most of the time in life, I'm not sure it's been a sort of positive sort of decision as against just a door opening and the opportunity coming along. And I have a tendency of walking through. I mean, I suppose that's true of politics as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you think that that's the difference between the generation that you're from and the one that I'm from, where for me at least, from the age of maybe 14 onwards, I was told that to get ahead in life, I had to go to university to specialize in a field. And then, so the pressure for the last 10 years of my life has been to pick one route and go down it. Whereas maybe in other decades, you would have had, more doors throughout your life.
Maybe you would. I don't know. I don't honestly know the answer to the question, because I think people say, well, we're sort of a more globalized world now. And but if you look at opportunities, particularly in the British middle classes in the colonial era, I mean, you could have ended up anywhere. You could have been doing on a tea plantation in Sri Lanka, walking around supervising things that you didn't know about. You could end up a DC in West Africa, or go to Hong Kong. Actually, the world, in a sense, I'm not sure the world is bigger now than it was then. I think you've got to just remain flexible, and don't be you've got to specialize. If you're going to achieve anything in life, you've got to, in the end, get serious, I think, at some point in your life. But I think you've also got to marry that with enjoying the ride a little bit. And I think that's there's a lovely George Melly, the jazz singer. He has a lovely quote, bit of advice for life, which I often tell young people, which is that he asked his father on his deathbed if he's got any advice for him, and his father said, "Yes, do what you want. I never did." And I think that's very good advice in general. The other, I mean, I sort of qualify it. Sometimes you've got to put up with things that you don't really like to achieve things. I think that's just true. But if something's working, stick with it, and if it's not, change it. Yeah.
That kind of happened with me really. After university, I went into like corporate communications and just just couldn't stand it and ended
Change
up.
it.
Yeah, I'm doing that this very second.
Yeah.
You see, you grew up in the Northeast,
Mm.
and that's you now live there now, and so you grew up with thoughts of Southeast Asia, and you ended up in London as a young man.
Mm.
Was it important for you for your children to grow up near or close to where you grew up?
I think actually in the way we are as a family, actually on a sort of decision as in terms of the family was largely, not largely, but it was very heavily influenced by my wife, who my wife is Australian. We had our first child in Australia because after we left London for a while, we lived there in New South Wales for a while, but we came back and I built a business, came back to the Northeast at that point. And Kim's father was an educator, teacher, and he rose up through the Catholic education system in New South Wales and ended up, being head of his part of New South Wales and headmaster in the capital city of a large Catholic school. And but to get that, he had to move around a lot. And like a lot of teachers in Australia, you sort of have to do your time. So the family were moved, they lived in Atherton in northern Queensland and Mergen and all, in Sydney for a while, back to Canberra. And so as kids, they were, and then back up to New South Wales and Armidale and the Tablelands. So actually what Kim has always wanted to do with is to have some sort of stable base. And we've stuck to that really. And I think it's worked, although the kids are out, the boys are out into the world, and none of them live in the Northeast. It's I said they have a strong connection to where they were, and just little things like the cricket team and the football team here in the village, and having friends when they come back. So I think it's a good idea to sort of stick to a place really. I was very lucky in terms of where we chose in the end. We lived in Newcastle for a while and then came out to Corbridge in the Tyne Valley, and I can't fault it really. I think this little bit of hinterland is as good as you can get, pretty much.
Hmm. Hmm. We'll start with your books, and the first book is The Verger, a short story by Somerset Maugham. It's a very it's a very simple and kind of wholesome story, right? Do you think? So it's
Yeah, I'll sort of, just to give the listeners sort of a view of it. So the premise of the book is, I'll sort of tell you what it's about. There's a verger at a little church, and a new vicar comes along and discovers that the verger can't read and lets him go. So, well, you can't be a verger of this church if you can't read. So he's walking out of the church and he wants a cigarette and he can't find a tobacconist. He goes home and speaks to his wife about it, and they end up getting a little shop, and then they get a few more shops. Ends up being very successful. And the key moment at the end of the book is when he's in the bank and his banker's talking about how much money he's got. And he said, "What?" And he asks him to sign a check, and he can't sign it. So I can't sign. I can't read or write. And the banker says, "Well, what? If you've got this massive retail empire and you can't read and write, just imagine what you could do if you could." And he said, "Well, I could tell you that. It'd be the verger at St. Michael's." And I know there's a joke in there, but it's an incredibly important lesson for life, because it's all about incommensurability. A lot of time, many times in life, something will appear that look like a setback or not a good outcome, and very often that's not true. I mean, it just so isn't true of many things that happen. You fail your 11 plus, disaster. You fail to get into the university that you want, and that's a very good example, because kids, now if they don't get into Oxford and they end up at Durham or something, it's a disaster. But of course, they may meet their life partner at Durham. And people, you've got to understand that when I mean incommensurate, I mean often, I think the mistake that we tend to make is that we think that route is better than that one. And I'm not making excuses for different routes. It's just that honestly, they're different. And often you can't measure them on the same scale. I'm sure the verger, if he'd stayed in St. Michael's being a verger, had been very happy. And I'm sure he was very happy, building his business. So they're just different routes. And I think it's not only very well written, I think Somerset Maugham described himself as the top of the second raters in short stories, story writing, novel writing. I think he's a first rater. And I think he's a first rater because, like all great novelists, he's a great observer of humanity and about human nature. And I don't think there's a better viewer of human nature than him in his period of writing. There might be better prose writers, but as just an observer, an acute observer of the nature of humanity, brilliant. So that's the book. That's the Verger. Yeah.
Yeah, it's it's like there's a serendipity in the sort of the sometimes cruelty of life.
Yeah. So it's often, don't despair. It's there are always silver linings and often better routes.
Yeah, and he realizes he's better off not being able to read.
Yeah.
Your second book, I fear went completely over my head, and it's A.J. Ayer's Language, Truth and Logic.
Yeah, I put that in because it's I sort of had to put a fill book in somehow, and there are so many, and actually I just put in, it's a wonderful, A.J. Ayer's a British analytic philosopher who was lucky enough very young to get, I think Gilbert Ryle sent him over to observe the Vienna Circle, the Vienna Kreis, as philosophers call it. So he was very lucky and observed it, and it was when logical positivism was just sort of brewing up in the late 20s, early 30s, and it was a period in the history of thought where Western philosophers particularly thought there was a chance of cracking it. They believed it was the high watermark of belief in science and logic. If only we apply rationality to everything and logic to everything, work it all out. And actually some of the German members of the group, literally, some of the tomes were literally, if we almost write down the facts about the world, series of facts, and apply it in this way, we'll find out what's happening. And of course, in retrospect, and later, and anyway, in retrospect, that was seen as quite a flawed, deeply flawed way of looking at the world. And there are technical problems in the book. But the book is really worth reading as the sort of high watermark of that, the confidence of that, because A.J. was, I think, 26 when he wrote it. And he talks about, eliminating metaphysics. What he means by metaphysics is eliminating religion or superstition of any kind. And it caused a rumpus in Oxford, and quite rightly. And there are some technical flaws with his logic, actually, believe it or not so much his logic, but he had this thing called the verification principle, which he couldn't demonstrate properly, and Popper refuted it later. And then they admitted that it was wrong, but it led to a movement post-war of people in British universities and American universities literally running around. If someone made a comment or made a statement, you were practically pinned to the wall, and how are you going to verify that? It was always the question. And I just think it's a great snapshot of British and American philosophy, I suppose. And as I say, it's interestingly written, full of confidence. So that's my fill book. One of many I could have picked, but it's as good as any to start with.
It's written at a time in the mid-30s when these new world modernist ideas were attempting to crack human problems, right? Like scarcity and like inequality and that sort of thing. So you have so 35 to what the Holodomors just happened, and Hitler's just risen to power.
Yeah, actually Hitler's coming to power was disastrous for the Vienna Circle, because many of them were Jewish and many of them were hounded out, and I think one was actually killed by a fanatic. But some got away, Gödel and a few, and a few others got away to the States and practiced after the war and developed good careers. But as I say, it's just worth reading. As I say, the high watermark of a particular analytical approach to philosophy, which in the end sort of wrung out humanity. There was no scope in this theorizing for religion or the place of faith in human thinking or whatever. And whether you're a believer or not, you can't wish that away. You can't pretend that human beings aren't like that. It was always I like Russell as well, Bertrand Russell. It was always his flaw that he couldn't see that, mankind wasn't rational. I mean, he always used to say, well, why can't people just be rational? Well, they're not. So if you're building a theoretical system on the basis of men being rational, it's not really going to work out for him. You can talk about economics and things, but so there's a lot in it. But I really like Ayer a lot. I mean, I think despite the fact that the book is largely wrong, it's written with such confidence, and I like him as a human being as well as a philosopher. I think if anyone's interested, just tap A.J. Ayer into YouTube and have a look at some of the 1970s discussions on logical positivism or other topics with Brian McGee, and you'll see an interesting philosopher, and one that's worth looking at. I've got everything Ayer wrote actually in first edition.
Was that a recent purchase, or have you always had them?
No, I think it's like people go through stages, don't they? Because I went through a positivist stage, and it's something you grow out of, I suppose. And yeah, I started. I mean, it probably started with language, truth, and logic, but you get into it, and then there's a brilliant biography, and he's got 2-volume autobiography, and so I started, and yes, I mean, I think he ranks with Bertrand Russell as in British 20th century philosophy, certainly, and worth looking at.
Brilliant. Your third book is The City in the Mountains, and I may need a second to figure out how to pronounce this name. Jose Maria de...
So I'll say it for you. Jose Maria de Epicurus.
Thank you.
Yeah. So a Portuguese writer, brilliant Portuguese writer from the late 1800s. He was born in Povoa de Varzim, just near Porto. And what is he? It's hard to describe him. I'll just describe this book. I mean, his canon's huge. And interestingly, he lived in Newcastle as a sort of ambassador to the Portuguese, and there's a little plaque in Grey Street where he lived. But this particular book is a classic because he's interested in an age-old sort of human, or as old as cities anyway, the conflict between living in a city with all its interest and all its stimulations and challenges, and the freedom of the hinterland, the freedom of the mountains. And of course, the main character in the book is on the Champs-Elysees, and he's living in Paris, and it's modernity, and he's got all his friends and all the intellectual life and everything, and he's got all his modern gadgets, and it's all about progress. And he disparages provinciality and so on. And then his gadgets don't work, and his friends prove to be superficial and cowardly. And by sheer chance, he goes out to his inherited sort of family place in Portugal, and he hates the idea of it. But of course, he grows to like it, and he grows to realize that actually true freedom is there. And a lot of the sort of social dogmas that he was constrained by in Paris are just nonsense, and real human needs are about peace and what you get in the mountains. So it's an age-old. It's full of truth, basically. And I think Epicurus sets it up beautifully. It's also very readable and very funny in parts, but he sets it up beautifully because he's such the protagonist is such a defender of the urban life, and then it flips, and it's so beautifully done. And like all really good literature, although this is translation, I do speak Portuguese, but not that well. I mean, I'm happy with the translation. It just reads very well, and so I'd urge anyone to have a look at it. There are lots of other Epicurus novels to look at, but that's probably the most accessible, I think.
Do you relate to it, having lived in London and then Newcastle and then settled down in the hinterland?
Very much, yeah. I think it's very much, yeah. I'd say I think it's been part of my life, that transition. But I think, like many people, many people remain urban dwellers and devoted to the preoccupations that you have in urban society. But the point is that a lot of it is superficial and fairly meaningless. And once you give it the flick, it loses meaning instantly. I mean, really, when you're in your stone yard and you're looking at what you're doing in the hinterland, it really ceases to be relevant at that point. And and a lot of it is superficial, actually. But I don't think it's new. I mean, my ancient that we're going to talk about later, the theme comes up again and again and again. So, as I say, I think it's a sort of ubiquitous, sort of perennial thing in life, and there'll always be this, it's town mouse, country mouse, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the city is, it's just all full of distractions, right? Full of things to go and do and be entertained for half an hour, but not a lot of opportunity to really kind of almost, to put it primitively, almost conquer a bit of land and sort of, cultivate it as your own. And
yeah, I think that's true, and it's in the human spirit to want the latter sometimes. But no, it's not just that, actually. It's like a lot of it comes out in politics, doesn't it? A lot. It's assumed that the urban is the sophisticated and is the intellectual and is the deeper, and actually that's not always the case either. I mean, there's an Acadian writer called Amy Liptrot who wrote a book a few years ago. She was in Hackney, had a bit of a drink problem, and went back to Orkney to sort of solve it. And she went not to where, I think her family's from West Mainland in Orkney, but she went to Papawestra, which is a small island of about 50 people on it, and got herself straightened out. But the book's very good. One of the best things in the book, one of the truest, acutest observations, is that her social circle was more limited in London than it was in Papawestra. I mean, literally, it was less diverse. You'd find it hard to imagine. Why was that? It was because in London, she sought and could secure friendships because of a vast choice of people. People that were basically her age and shared her outlook. So she was in a little bubble of people that were rather like her. In Papawestra, that wasn't possible. For a start, she had to work. I think she worked in a lighthouse or something, and had to work on shifts with people of various ages. Turned out the people were from on the outer islands of Orkney, a lot of people aren't Acadians, so they're from all over the world. And of course, it would just be an absurd observation, but it was a truth that Orkney, that outer island of Orkney, contained far more diversity in outlook, opinion, background, so on, than her social group in Hackney. So
that doesn't surprise me.
No, it's there. But it's a sort of killer observation, I thought.
Yeah, I'll have to give that a read. We'll move along to music now, which is something that we've spoken about in bits prior to going into recording. So something we never discussed on the record, but your first album is George Harrison's 1970 solo record, All Things Must Pass. Yeah.
So I was a Beatles fan, and then you have to choose a Beatle, I suppose, and I chose George. This is an absolute masterpiece of popular music. What happened towards the end of the Beatles? I mean, as the relationships declined and so on, they gave him little crumbs, gave him sort of, one or two, songs on an album, and some of those are brilliant. But
Here Comes the Sun, While My Guitar Gently Weeps.
Yeah, something, and all these things, which is the only one that Sinatra really sang. So, well, that's a bit syrupy, that one, to be honest. So he built up, and also Lennon and McCartney. He was younger than Lennon and McCartney, and started off as the guitarist, but of course, as a songwriter, just suddenly, like a lot of people do in their late 20s, just bang, blossomed and suddenly exploded with creativity. And he built up all these songs, a lot of which we couldn't use, and they tried as Beatles songs and didn't do them. So he had this massive sort of backlog of songs, and when they split, he just started spending more time in Abbey Road in 69, 70, and All Things Must Pass as the result. And from literally from the start, I think it's I'd Have You Any Time, which is a Dylan Harrison collaboration, to What Is Life and Wah Wah. And all Things Must Pass Itself, and Beware of Darkness, which is fantastic. It's a little bit overdone. It's a little bit of its time in that it's six sides of music. It's a triple album, and I as I said before, I think it's a masterpiece anyway. But there's a masterpiece 10-track album in there, because when you get to the sixth side and they're sort of jamming things, a little bit indulgent, but it was a thing of the time. But no, as a work of art, it's going to stand the test of time. The only thing that Harrison didn't like about it, in retrospect, was the massive amount of reverb that's put on everything.
Hmm.
And I think he wanted to, before he died, he wanted to re-record it and take some of that off. And actually, the producers sort of said, no, it's not a good idea. And I think it stands up very well. I think it really is a brilliant bit of music. And so, yeah, and I don't think he did anything that came near it after that. I think it's his, I mean, it's a bit like some filmmakers, you know, like Jacques Tati did Mr. Hulot's Holiday and Mon Oncle. And actually, even after Mr. Hulot's Holiday, his debt to humanity was discharged, and he could have gone and done something else. And same with Harrison, really. I don't think he got near it after that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it feels like he really shined on this one. The context of the album is quite interesting. I think in the late '60s, he went to the US and he hung up with Dylan, and I think he met the guys from the band, and what he
Yeah.
noticed with them is that they gave him, sort of creative equality within the group, whereas in the sessions with the Beatles, he was dominated by John and in particular Paul. It's an underrated, or at least underreported cause for the breakup was the Paul and George, they fell out because Paul was like dominating him in the studio. But here it's like he's it's his record, right? And I think he ran into that really well. And there are some really beautiful songs on there. The song "I Live for You" really stands out to me.
Yeah, another one is the Ballad of Sir Frankie Crisp, which starts off with pedal steel. But that's an example. I think it's a brilliant observation there, Sam, because actually Harrison was frankly a more friendly. He valued friendship to a greater extent than the others. I mean, when the Beatles broke up, McCartney went off to southern Scotland and on his farm, and Lennon was a very irascible character, very difficult character. George Harrison's, if you look at the quality of his friends, Clapton and Dylan, but so what he got out of those musicians was friendship. And so the bassists, Klaus Voormann, wonderfully underrated bassist. Carl Radl plays on the album. He's got Ringo Starr. I think Jim Keltner plays on the album on the drums as well. So he's got a massive array of wonderful musicians. I suppose that came out in the concert of Bangladesh in '72, didn't it? When he had all his mates in Madison Square Garden, and which was the start of, I suppose, the start of Live Aid and pop stars doing charity gigs. But you couldn't have done it unless it was genuine friendship, and so it's a tribute to him. And as I say, it's the necessary and sufficient George Harrison album, to be honest. It's wonderful.
And like there's sometimes in the album where it feels like he's sort of taking aim at the Beatles, like Wah Wah sounds like it's about his frustrations with the Let It Be sessions or whatever. And but it was more tactful. It was written at a time, when John Lennon was singing, I Don't Care About Beatles on the song God, or Paul was writing a song like Too Many People, where he says to John, that was your first mistake. You took your lucky break and you broke it in two. They were kind of, they were kind of, again, sort of.
Yeah, actually, it's wonderful you mentioned that, because actually the other hotspot. I mean, I think McCartney is an intermittent genius songwriter, and actually he had a soft spot. I'm not a hotspot, although his was homemade. So McCartney and Ram and Wildlife and things were, either with not very impressive band members, or McCartney doing it on his own. But Too Many People, which I think is the first track on Ram, I think, wonderful song. And so I suppose they were all going through some emotional turmoil, which often creates great art. But Harrison was the link between the two, because often, I mean, Lennon and McCartney weren't speaking, but of course remember that Harrison plays on a lot of the Lennon stuff. So he right into Imagine and even earlier in '68, '69. So anyway, it's there and we're lucky to have it.
I think Harrison's on Mind Games too.
Yeah.
Your second piece is something that I two things. One, I couldn't find a version of, which we'll get into, and two, I also don't really feel confident pronouncing this one.
No, well, I'm not going to try the French. Actually, it translates as Three Black Pieces for the White Keys, which is, just to fill in. I got into Concert Lambert. A friend of mine was when I was in London did a lot of book reviews for the Times and Guardian. He was literary editor for the Guardian for a while, and he's now an academic in the States in Harvard. But he did a review of a book called The Lamberts, which was about George Lambert, the painter, Constant Lambert, the composer, and Kit Lambert, the manager of the Who. Very interesting book. And I after James had finished reviewing it, he gave it to me, and I had a look at it. And I started, because I was a Who fan, I was interested in Kit Lambert, but I started buying Constant Lambert stuff. And Constant Lambert's an interesting English composer, died quite young in his 40s, but practiced in the sort of 1920s, 30s really, and was an interesting composer because he was a student of jazz as well, but he's really a classical composer, I suppose. And so I had a few Constant Lambert pieces anyway, and CDs, but I was driving somewhere and I heard this particular track, which is actually, it's a series, it's 3 duets, and this is the 3rd one, Siesta. And I heard it by chance on the radio, probably on Classic FM or something, and I couldn't buy it. I couldn't find it anywhere. And in the end, I looked and looked and looked, and I found a rendition of it in Dorfman's in Friedrichstraße in Berlin eventually, and sort of that was the start. I think there are only 3 published recordings of it, and it's a wonderful piece. As it says, it's a duet which is comprised just of the white keys. And it's a little bit melancholy, 3 or 4 separate movements, which, like jazz, he sort of dangles the theme and then it goes somewhere else and he changes it and finishes it off. But as a lockdown challenge, I learnt it by ear and did my own rendition of it. I'm not 2 people, so I've
right, yeah.
summarized the duet really, but. And I play it, try and keep it up most days. But it's a wonderful thing, and as I said, it's because it's in my mind now. I just thought I'd put that in.
Mm-hmm. How long have you been playing piano?
Ever since I was forced as a child.
Right.
It's not my. I can't remember which grade I got to, but I ditched it when I sort of became rebellious, a bit more rebellious in my teens. So I'm basically a guitarist and drummer, and drumming in particular, I've done more than anything else. Probably not through choice really, but because if you're a drummer, you get people need drummers, and you get into bands.
Yeah,
there are loads of guitarists.
My dad's drummer. He played with Chick Corea in the 80s.
Wow. Okay. Well, I'm massively impressed there.
He filled in for Dave Weckl in a gig in Tel Aviv in '82. Oh,
fantastic. Yeah. We'll have to talk about that. Yeah.
He played with drummer Snafu.
No.
It was one of the guys. It was the drummer from Procol Harum's second band. Okay. He played with them too for a while. But I'll probably cut this part out. My dad likes to sort of keep a low profile these days.
Yeah. Easy.
yeah. Sure. At some point, yeah. Your 3rd piece is Work Song by Nat Addy, and I think I got the pronunciation there.
Nat Nathaniel Adderley. Yeah. This is I had to put some jazz in because I mainly listen to jazz now, and it's always difficult. It's such a huge canon, and the Penguin Guide to Jazz. It's sort of been worked out. The editors couldn't possibly listen to it all. It's probably true, but I wanted to put something in which was. I'm going to say something which sounds sort of a bold statement, but I think music is the highest art form, and I think jazz, in particular, hard bop is the bright spot and the highest period of the highest art form. And so I wanted to just put an exemplar of that. And this Nat Addy is not as well known as he's a cornet player, not as well known as his brother Cannonball Adderley, and he played with him a good foil at times. But this is a lovely album recorded in New York in January 1960, I think, and it's a sextet largely. And he's invited Wes Montgomery along as a guitar player, sort of famous for octave runs, and they duel. And it's just a really lovely sort of relaxed, quite stripped down. There's a couple of lovely ballads in there where Nat sort of lets go, and there's a Cannonball Adderley song on the first song on the second side called Sack of Woe, which is one of my favorite all-time things. They play this on this album. They play it a bit quicker than Cannonball Adderley plays it. Probably the quickest version I've heard, actually. And it's just a wonderful album. So I'd sort of recommend it. You in jazz, it's easy in a way when you're recommending albums to go for the what are called, you know, in the encyclopedia, the 4-star crown albums. You know, you could say go Brubeck's, Brubeck Time, or go for, you know, I don't know,
Kind of Blue.
like, yeah, Kind of Blue, yeah, or even Cannonball Adderley, something else, which is you know, there. So any of that stuff, or some of the Coltrane stuff, you know, in the jazz canon seems to be higher rated, but I'd start here. I mean, I think it's great. It's one of my favorite things. It's a real Saturday morning Saturday morning album. You know, just stick it on, and it's got a bit of everything. And as I say, it's really 1960s towards the end of hard bop. I mean, 60, 62, 63 it was done, but yeah, it's pretty much at the sort of white heat of that. And the other thing I would say is that the cornet is quite an unusual. I mean, not many front men were cornet players, and I think they're sort of the you know, the poor cousins in a way, because it's all trumpets and sax or tenor sax, you know, in jazz. So, but I think just as an instrument, it's a softer. I mean, I like Davis, I like Miles Davis a lot, but of course, if you go with Kind of Blue or something like that, it's very shrill. I mean, it really is shrill, and it's not really to my taste. Nat Addy played a lot with J.J. Johnson, and who's a trombonist, and I think, again, Kai Winder and Johnson and people, they didn't really get anywhere with trombone as front men, but it's very democratic. I mean, I think the only thing I would say about jazz, it takes time, because a lot of, particularly when they're improvising, people don't know what's going on, and a lot of people just say it's just noise, but it's not. I mean, I mean, this is pretty tradition. It's pretty easy to get a hold of this album, but it's not. It's just that they're doing what jazz musicians do, which is duel and improvise. So if you know, Kim and I went, you know, we were go to some of the jazz festivals, and if you have 3 days of it, I remember a few years ago we had 3 days of it, and you've seen about 30 acts. And I switched on the radio, which is, in my case, was stuck on Radio 3, and of course classical music sounds so rigid. I mean, there's incredible rigidity to it compared to what we've been listening to, and so that it's just completely different. For me, it's the highest, it's the best, and I think this is the best period of the best art form. So that's why that's in there.
You mentioned a cornet. It's one of the instruments where it's kind of like a flugelhorn to me, where when you hear it lead, you notice it more. It just really sticks out to you. I want to focus on the opening, the first song titled "Work Song."
Yeah.
It's one of those songs where it's almost like a time machine song. I listen to it, and it's all like being in a time and place that I've never known. You know, it's like I listen to it and suddenly I'm in some, you know, smoky jazz bar in like the mid-century South. You know.
Well, it is. It's New York in 1960, January 1960. It'll have been cold. They'll have recorded it in the basement, and you get that in jazz. Somehow it just sort of. And of course, Work Song starts off with a really quite a simple little theme, and then they go off very quickly from there. But I still think Sack of Woe is the best. And you've got 2 ballads in the middle of each side, you know, which are well worth. And actually, probably in performance terms, the Adderley's cornet playing's best in the ballad. I can't remember what it's called on the second side, midway through the sides. Probably technically the best, but just for sheer fun, Sack of Woe is just absolute gold.
There's parts in the record where the cornet and the drums kind of communicate. It's like a call and respond, and then they'll kind of, you know, sort of go together, and then the cornet will dominate, and the drums will occasionally break through, and it's very kind of
constant dueling. I mean, that's right. And again, it's quite unusual, because there weren't that many. You got Django Reinhardt and people like that, and others on the guitar, but there weren't that many guitar front, you know, band leaders, you know, who played the guitar. And of course, Montgomery in this spends most of his time when he's not doing these octave runs, which is his signature, dueling with him. He listens, and you can tell they're making it up as they're going along, which is what it's all about. But yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I think the other, I mean, Brubeck Time is the other one that I might have put down, but it's a little bit odd album because there's none of it's 4/4, and it was done as a sort of almost a joke because it's all in odd time signatures, but there's a track called Audrey, which I think is the first track on that album, and that is just a thing of beauty. I mean, that's absolutely, just as I say, it's in a basement in New York. I think that's 1956 they recorded, or 57 they recorded that, and boy, you transported back into that. It could only sound that with the tonality and everything else. That place in that time, and then like a lot of art, a lot of other things, it doesn't endure, and it's, as soon as it peaks, it's done, and yeah, we're very lucky to have the recordings.
Yeah, we really are. Were you always into jazz, or did that come to you?
No, I sort of, I had a very standard sort of, I was born in 65, so I had a very standard sort of, Beatles and Stones, Who, Led Zeppelin, Pink Floyd, Deep Purple, all that sort of thing. So heavy rock really in the 70s. And then, we observed punk, and all that. I mean, as a drummer, I was mainly in punk bands actually later on, but and I don't particularly like punk actually, but it was there. But no, I sort of always listened to it, I listened, but only the standard stuff, just sort of compilations in my teens, and then really got into it in my 20s by going to see live jazz in London, and then continued to do so in the north, and ever since I listened. I don't say I listen to nothing else, but 90% of, if I'm not listening to Henry Purcell or something, I listen to a bit of rock and pop, but I mean, jazz is basically 90% of it. Yeah.
All right, let's move on to films. Your film is The Servant from 1963 by John Losey.
Joseph Losey, yeah.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Let me do that again. Your film is The Servant by Joseph Losey, released in 1963.
Yeah, I mean, this is a classic, an absolute classic film. It was based on a novel by Robin Morn. I don't think it was any relation to Somerset Maugham, by the way. And it's about, the premise of the film is about the relationship between a man and his servant, and the premise is basically the servant slowly usurps him and controls him, and gets the better of him, basically. And some people, it was 63, and some people think it's a sort of metaphor of the 60s and revolution and so on. And the screenplay was done by Harold Pinter, and he was constantly asked when it came out, is it a metaphor for social change and revolution, and has it got this sort of subtext and that? And he said, no, it's about a man and his servant. Which is very good.
Yeah. Sometimes it is just, sometimes it is just a story, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's both really. But Dirk Bogarde plays the servant. James Fox, Lawrence Fox's father, plays the chap, and it's got Wendy Craig as the sort of love interest, I suppose. James Fox's girlfriend and so on. And so I would urge anyone who's interested in brilliant film, British film in particular, to have a look at it. It's a slightly creepy film. And when they made it, it was ahead of its time. Joe Losey was an exiled filmmaker from the States, who was certainly a leftist, probably communist, and was in Britain working under pseudonyms because of McCarthyism, and so maybe there was some revolution in it, but it was too hot for the distributors in '63 when they made it. It didn't get distribution, and then all of a sudden, like a social turn occurred a little bit later, and it went bang in '64, and '65 it was off. So yeah, it's one of these films I mean, I'm guilty of watching really brilliant film again and again and again, and I don't know how many times I've seen it, but it's a masterpiece.
I haven't seen it.
Have a look. Honestly, it will repay massively. You will love it. It's.
I reckon I would.
It's beautifully shot, and it's the first opening scene is in Royal Avenue in Chelsea, and just got this massive sweep, and I mean, Dirk Bogarde's performance is masterful. The timing and the intensity, incredible.
Yeah, I do have a real soft spot for that kind of era. that time, the films of that time. So yeah, I probably should check it out. The film on my list is a With No One Eye, which is sort of similar. Wasn't made then, but it's sort of same sort of kind of. You could view it as being kind of class relations in the 60s.
Yeah, and with no, I mean, I think that has been seen as a sort of a metaphor of the end of the 60s, isn't it? When Marwood cuts his hair, he's I suppose he's growing up and he's getting on, and the fun is over, and he's Marwood moves on, and with Nell's left in the park. And again, a brilliant film. I could have put that film. It's certainly in the top 10, isn't it? It's a wonderful. Will we ever be free?
Even before Marwood leaves, when they're all smoking the Camberwell carrot, they call it, and Danny's saying, we had 99 days to the end of this decade, and there's going to be a lot of refugees.
Bring out your dead.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's true. Yeah, it is, and Marwood's always a more sensible character in Withnell. So he all along Withnell wants to party, and Marwood's trying to take calls in Keswick, to try and get the particular role, and it was Journey's End, wasn't he? I think it was R.C. Sheriff's play that he was auditioning for and eventually got. But yeah, I don't think it comes much better. Brilliant film. But if you like Withnell, you'll love The Servant.
Oh, brilliant! Yeah, I'll check it out. So we'll move along again to your historical figure. I think someone you mentioned to me on Twitter before is Epicurus.
Yeah, so Epicurus. So I'm obviously a student of philosophy, and Epicurus is my favorite ancient, and is also someone that I would go as far as to say I'm an Epicurean, and I accept his basic view of the world, the universe, and humanity's place in it, and I would choose Epicurus because, I mean, of the ancients, obviously Socrates, Aristotle, and Plato are better known, and well, certainly better writers probably. Well, Socrates didn't write much, but certainly Aristotle is difficult to beat, really. But if philosophy is about getting things right, getting your observations in line, if you want your philosophy to correspond to reality, Epicurus gets a tick for that. And also the prescriptions, I think he's got right as well. So just to give people a brief, he was an atomist, a follower of Democritus. So he thought, and it was an incredible intellectual achievement. The Greek atomists reasoned their way into the conclusion that the primary substance is the atom in the universe. That's the thing. That's the metaphysical unit. And it was incredible how they did this. They reasoned. It was below the threshold of anything you could see. So they reasoned their way in by saying, well, if you get an object and cut it in half, you get something smaller, and you get cut it and continue cutting it in half until you reach something that you can't cut in half, which is an atom, the uncuttable. That's what it means. And so everything's made of atoms. And so they're the permanent feature of the universe, and anything else is temporary. And if you understand that, then this cup and this table and you and I and this computer and everything else is all temporary. So they're just temporary agglomerations of atoms, and the atoms in the end will go on and form new alliances elsewhere after they've finished with us. So what Epicurus did was try and marry that sort of physical theory, the atomist theory, with ethics, with morality, with what should we do, how should we live. And he, to sort of sum it up, is actually, unfortunately, for good or bad, it's on the back of a lot of Land Rovers, which is one life, live it. Basically, it's the easiest way to explain it. So you don't survive death. Your position after death is identical to what it is before birth. You've got nothing to fear. There's just nothing. So what you should do is to try and enjoy your life and do no harm. And interestingly, so he was a hedonist because he thought that life was about enjoying life and about pleasure. But the interesting thing is how what he prescribes to get to that. So he says that actually pleasure consists in having enough and not overdoing it, and having moderate desire, and living in a moderate way. And that's really the key to life, knowing what limits are. It's not to say that if luxury appears occasionally, you shouldn't go for it. He was in favor of that. But broadly speaking, you should live a simple life, match your needs to what is necessary, and be kind and do good. And there are a load of maxims you can read. The Vatican collection of Epicurean maxims is very good. Or Letter to Menocius, have a read of that. But basically it's live well and do good and live simply, and then you'll be happy broadly, or it gives you the most chance of happiness.
It's interesting how a lot of classical concepts in philosophy become it becomes lost in the modern day. Like, take for example, you said hedonism. Contemporarily, you think of hedonism as being, going out on the piss and
Yeah.
drinking a bit too much and like taking this, taking that. Whereas he describes it as being, a simple and fulfilling life. Also, you can take a word like, I don't know, cynical, which it initially meant a rejection of sort of
Dog-like rejection.
material abundance in favor of simplicity. And then today, it's seen as being sort of self-interest pathologized.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, the to go back to Epicurus, I mean, he got his what you call the hedonic, what philosophers call the hedonic calculus, right? In that, if you understand it, if it's high time preference, if a bottle of wine comes, you just glug it. Epicurus made the obvious statement: if you glug wine all the time, you'll be ill, and you'll feel ill in the morning. So there's you've got to understand that there's constant consumption, overconsumption of things is not a good idea. There's a lovely little quote: "If you want to make Pythocles happy, limit his desires." Or other Epicurean statements like, "It is better to be to lie on a crate than to be anxious on a golden couch." All of these things are true, and they're as true now as they were in the 3rd century BC. And I think that's where, you can read Epicurus now and say, yeah, absolutely bang on. So, as I say, I think we'd be very well to try and live as good Epicureans if we can. I think the first principal doctrine is that it's impossible to live a pleasant life unless you do good. It sounds basic, but it is sort of true. And he was very influential, actually. I mean, Epicureanism was certainly, prior to the Romans adopting Christianity formally, in Greece and Rome, was a very prominent philosophy among intellectuals. And it was Lucretius, the famous Roman poet, and Hadrian was an Epicurean. Marcus Aurelius gave money to the Epicurean school after he died. So very respectable. I think in the end, the reason it didn't take was a, you might say, slightly depressing one, is that it was just too true. It was, a lot of people found the sort of atomism just too bleak. The realization that you don't endure. There's nothing after death. So he didn't. The sort of vulgar. Oh, what should I say? Haven't I? The sort of vulgar element to some religions of offering, crudely offering goodies. Without that, perhaps religions couldn't really get a role. So Epicureanism was always a little bit, popular among the middle classes in Athens, but the bosses didn't like it. The elites didn't like it because it was slightly subversive, because it was anti-consumption, really, and of course what's called the masses that didn't respond to it because what's in it for me? I mean, life's bad enough, I mean, and the elites like a religion that promises something later, because then you have to put up with things now. But Epicurus say, we don't have to. I mean, you've got to get it right. You've only got one shot. You've got to get it right now. So there's lots of reasons technically why it sort of why it was deliberately snuffed out by Christianity, cruelly actually. But it doesn't surprise me. I mean, it's Christianity became the enduring legacy of the Roman Empire throughout Christendom, and but that's just the turn it said. I think it's true today. I think it's probably always, Epicureanism will always be a minority interest, because it's tough to as I say, democracy and atomism is, a lot of people describe as extremely bleak, but it depends what you want.
Also, I suppose it'd be unpopular because it is low time preference.
Oh yeah, it is. It is. It's what he's saying is it won't get you anywhere. Constantly having desires that you can't fulfill, and if you have no limit to what you want, you'll never be happy. I mean, there's always someone with a bigger boat. I think that's the as I say, I think the reason that I like Epicureanism is that it speaks now as much as it did then. All of these things are human truths, which are as applicable now as any other time. But I accept also. I did my dissertation at Durham on Epicurus, and I wouldn't. When you get into Epicurean philosophy, you always realize that it will be a minority interest. Just is. It's got it had no chance of being adopted as a religion.
There's something there in limiting your desires. There's an old like anecdote. I can't remember where it comes from, but it's there's a wealthy merchant with a big palace, and there's a pauper who lives across the road from him in a box, and he goes to the pauper and says, like, my home is so much nicer than yours, and the pauper replies, well, my view is much nicer than yours. Right? It's happiness can be found in perspective rather than just material. Yeah,
that's right. I mean, there are lots of anecdotes about that, and one of the more recent ones actually, you could I think it was from Greece, where, let's say there's a Greek peasant in his field, and there's a property speculator, from a merchant bank saying, "Oh, hello, is this your land?" And he says, "Yes, it is." "And these are your sheep?" "Yeah, they're my sheep and goats." "Well, we want to buy it to build a great big hotel complex and offer you several £1 million for it, dollars for it." And he said, "Well, it's not for sale." And the banker says, "Well, yeah, but you'd be very rich if you sell it to me, and if you're rich, you could do exactly what you want to do." He says, "Doing exactly what I want to do now." That's the whole point.
Yeah. Your modern figure is John Gray. So another sort of another thinker.
Yeah. I'm a huge John Gray fan. I think pretty much for the same reason as I'm a fan of Epicurus. I think he's right. I think his rightometer, if there is such a thing as correctometer, is blisteringly high. I mean, his observations, his prescriptions, his analysis of, to quote your phrase, our current predicament in the West is just absolutely spot on. And it's occasionally cutting prose as a critic of liberalism. I think he is the political philosophy you need to read now, right now.
Yeah, no. He's a bit of a battering ram through sort of kumbaya liberalism, right? He views is a far more like realistic view of human nature. Yeah,
so he is, but it's with Gray. The nice thing about it is he has the humility to write proper political philosophy books like Enlightenment's Wake or whatever. Where you can, if you're interested in a critic of Rawlsian rights-based theory, you can do the work and have a read, and it's a wonderful critique of it. But if you want to read, his pieces, if you get into the New Statesman and just read his columns and his book reviews there, or go on to BBC Sounds and his Point of View podcasts, wonderful. And actually, I took the trouble of just scribbling down a few Gray-isms. These aren't necessarily my favorites, but they're just little things. I wanted to just give you some little snapshots. So these are little things which I've written down from some of his essays in New Statesman. These are taken at complete random. If the past decade teaches us anything, it is that an inability to grasp political realities increases with levels of education. Great. That's a typical Grayism. I'll give you another. It's hard to see why any sensible person would enroll in a humanities degree at the present time. equally very, very good.
No, it's true. At university, I was at university from 2015 to 2019, and I saw people in real time be almost educated beyond their intelligence.
Yeah, I mean, but the humanities, particularly in the West at the moment, are fractured. And I think there are serious problems. But again, just to get back to it, if there's a major event in recent Western history, he's nailed it right. So I was in a minority when the Iraq War happened. I was in a minority of bitterly opposing it, and I think I was right. I think I was right. Most people went along with it or were convinced by it. I think it was utter disaster and folly. And I think history, I mean, we've just had the Americans finally creeping out of Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan, and rather in the same way as they did in '74 off the roof of the American embassy in Saigon. This is total humiliation, and it's bad on all levels. Bad for the host country, bad for the invader. It reduces the competence and possibility of defending yourself when you need to. 650,000 excess deaths and so on and so on. Blair and Bush, the neocon project was just utterly deranged and naive. And of course, who called it right? John Gray. And he wrote a book about it. So there's very, very little that, and his analysis, I mean, more recently, say in 2016, his analysis of the frenzy, the sort of the intelligentsia in New York when Trump got in went into a total, almost diagnosable meltdown, a panic, and then started grasping at conspiracy theories. They started saying it was the Russians or it was this or that, vote regularly, anything at all. And really, they were just in a spasm because they couldn't believe that their outlook was so misaligned to the reality of how most of their fellow citizens thought. It can't be. So you have to invent. Same as AC Grayling, the people just lose their minds. And I think, again, Gray is such a wonderful critic of the sort of modern hyperliberal. So I've got to have Gray as my contemporary figure, and I just think just wonderful. I every time, every month when you check the New Statesman website and there's a new one up, I just love it. And actually, like a lot of good thinkers, sometimes it's the same thing in various forms, but I just think he's a wonderful political philosopher and wonderful critic, and so there you go. And he's also a Geordie. So
it isn't just the social, political, and geopolitical sphere where he was, as you said, just right. He wrote 1998. He wrote False Dawn, in which he attacked this end of history, globalist neoliberal fantasy. 10 years before it really kind of it was laid bare by the 2008 crash.
Oh yeah, no, certainly. That book, I mean, it's a typical Gray feature, is to observe and to diagnose about 20 years prior to events unfolding, or many people realizing that he was right. False Dawn, I mean, in that one, and Black Mass is the same. I think Straw Dogs is his, in a way, the most popular, but it's also the least serious book in a way because it's so bleak. I think the famous quote from that is, after reading it, it was so bleak. Someone said, "Well, if I thought what Gray thought, I think he was speaking to Gray. So if I thought what you thought, I wouldn't get up in the morning." And John Gray said, "Well, perhaps you shouldn't." That's a typical Grayism. So no, but on global markets, again, on what he calls market or imperialism, I think he calls it. It doesn't occur to people that the neoliberal and market liberal sort of philosophy that we've been given, which has a terrible record actually in the West, an appalling record in terms of productivity and growth, employment, balanced payments, an absolutely dreadful record in reality. But he looks at things like the idea of global free trade, and this is a highly utopian project. This is no chance of occurring. I mean, long term, it just won't. And the political, what these projects, what these utopian projects run into always, is a political problem. Because for ex-industrial workers in the West, you have to accept that your position in world is just eviscerated on the altar of some idea of the cheapest being the best always. So and in the end, people won't accept that, and they shouldn't accept it. And so your sort of liberal dream that these theorists have is in the end just fails on contact with reality. So I don't think there's any. The only thing I don't agree with Gray about is his preference for cats over dogs. That's it.
Yeah. Well, so the last item on the list is your inanimate object, which is the one that I find the most interesting because everyone's is radically different. For Peter Hitchens, it was a cathedral in France. For Paul Embry, it was a family heirloom. Myself, it's a tennis ball. Yours is a what is it? It's a site in Orkney, right?
Yeah, I had to think carefully about this because lots of, I mean, I sort of put this in slightly tongue in cheek because, I mean, I could have had, one of my busts of Epicurus or something like that, or something like that, or a gift, or as you say, something that I treasure personally, that, or cigar box from my grandfather. But I put this in because is it an object? I'm not even sure it is. It's a building. It's a
it counts.
Yeah, because it's a thing.
So
just to give people an idea, it was built. The Brock itself is a large building. It was built probably 500 BC, 600 BC, and it's on a little sort of promontory on Ironhaller Sound, which is on the north side of the main, what was called mainland Orkney, the biggest island in Orkney, and it's just a beautifully sited little Iron Age village. But this Brock itself, it's degraded now, but in its fine, when it was built, it would have been probably 10 meters high. Would have had a conical wooden sort of turf roof. It's a thing of beauty, and it's also a thing of magnificence, which is old, and it's pre-Viking. It was probably used. The Vikings turned up in, which is sort of, I would say, my lot. It turned up in sort of 700 AD, something like that, and the Brock probably survived until about 100 AD. So whether it was the same Pictish or indigenous family, we don't really know, and no one really knows. Historians have to rely on theory on these things, don't they? The lack of place names, the lack of Pictish place names in Orkney, and the prevalence of Norse names everywhere would indicate probably quite a quick conquest, and probably fairly brutal. Because usually, if you coexist, you say, "What's that called?" and there's a bleed into the new language, but there wasn't. But anyway, it's a thing. It's a wonderful settlement, and it's probably, of the many Orcadian archaeological sites, it's probably the best small set piece you'll see, because Skara Brae and Midhow and Maeshow and the Ness, when Neil Oliver has been to several times, they're ones that people talk about, and they're better known, but they're not as good. So this is just a thing of beauty, and you can see the stonework. I mean, the exterior stonework, all of the stonework, rain is going to occur, so a lot of the stonework is slanted, to deal with rain, and it's just beautifully constructed, and would have been, for the family who are in charge of it, it would have been really a thing of magnificence, and any visitor from anywhere in the world at the time would have been impressed by it. So Brock of Gurness, is my object, a thing of magnificence, beauty, and humanity.
From above, it looks quite sprawling, right? It looks like it's quite opulent for the time.
Yeah, I think the set piece itself is just the Brock itself, which is the main tower, the principal building, the principal house, as it were, of the head of that human group. And it's interesting in human history in Orkney, it's the same as everywhere else with communities. There are smaller Brocks. This is quite a big one, but the theory is that you get about between 70 people in one of these communities up to about 150, maybe 180 max. 180 is just too big, and then some groups are split off and set their own thing up elsewhere. So I guess it tells us something about ourselves as well, about how big, what scale we can live at without tension, or without also some of us wanting to not live underneath the patriarch, that particular patriarch. So yeah, I think it's, if you ever travel to Orkney, that's the place I would head.
William Clouston, that was your life in 10.
Thank you. Cheers. Pleasure. Take care.
Bye.